Okay, yeah.
Good evening, comrades, and welcome back to the Online Communist Forum. Although this is a forum for members and supporters of the Communist Party of Great Britain, it's also open to members of any other group or people who are not in any group at all. So, welcome back after our short 2-week break. Over to Jack Conrad for a discussion of the news events of the week.
Well, I'm not going to be talking about last week. I'm going to be talking about the week before as well, and maybe even the week before that, because yes, we've had a break, and obviously over that break, we had tragic deaths in Southport on July the 29th, when three young girls were killed and eight other girls were injured, and two adults were also injured. And of course, we all know what happened subsequently. Some story went round about it being the act of a asylum seeker who'd traveled to Britain on a small boat, was a Muslim. Okay, later it turned out to not be the case, that it was, let me get the name right, Axel Rudabana, who was born in Wales, of a Rwandan background. But of course, what we had on the night of the 29th going into the 30th of July were riots, an attack on the local mosque. And from there, things went nationwide. And so from Belfast to Sunderland, from Plymouth to Hartlepool, from Liverpool to Rotherham, you name it, there were outbreaks of violence. Not only were mosques attacked, shops were attacked. I'm guessing that the shops would have been perceived of as Muslim or Asian British or something along those lines. Certainly hotels and hostels that were housing asylum seekers, they were subject to attack. And we even had passers-by in this town or city stopped and demands made that they prove not only were they white, but they were English, i.e. some sort of colour and language test was applied. Okay, so let's ask ourselves what the causes were. Clearly not the Southport killings. That was certainly a trigger, but clearly the causes go far, far deeper than that. And therefore, I'm also going to discount not the role, but the causal role of so-called influencers like Tommy Robinson. I mean, is he in Cyprus at the moment? He's certainly a factor, but to describe him as a cause would sort of get you to imagine that the people involved in these riots were a sort of disciplined military formation. They weren't anything of the sort. So they weren't acting under orders. If you want, they were primed and ready. And this particular moment on July the 29th happened. And that was basically all it took. So we need to go further. And I know it's trite. You can read it in any left-wing paper, but it just so happens that I think it's true. And that is, if we want to look for causes, we need to look to the last Tory government and Theresa May and her hostile environment. We need to look at the last Prime Minister and his lectern and his promise to stop the small boats. Meanwhile, subtext, what that is code for is migrants, ignoring the fact, of course, that while the Tories, banged the drum about illegal migrants crossing the English Channel, they basically didn't, let the public in on the fact that the vast majority of people who come to Britain are legal migrants, and something that is encouraged or has been encouraged in reality by successive governments, not least in order to, how should I put it, serve the interests of big business, but also public services. So that's simply the truth. But meanwhile, of course, the Tories have been demonising migrants, and we have to include the Labour Party there. Keir Starmer has been pursuing a policy of triangulation, and therefore, if the Tories problematized and demonized people coming to Britain, in small boats, the Labour Party was guilty of doing exactly the same thing. And indeed, if we look at Yvette Cooper, just days before these riots began, she was actually making a speech saying how the Labour Party was going to, this is, the sort of favourite word of government, isn't it, clamp down on illegal migrants. And of course, we also need to factor in not only illegal migrants, but I would argue also Gaza protests, and Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, going on about these hate marches. I mean, I've been on every single national demonstration bar one, and they are certainly not hate demonstrations or anything remotely like it, but demonizing, protests around Gaza, demonizing migrants has created an atmosphere of where we get over 4 million votes for reform, clearly a protest vote. Yes, they ended up with, a handful of MPs, but more votes than the Liberal Democrats. I'm not saying for one moment that all reform voters were rioters, but I would say that most rioters, I would expect, I've got no actual evidence for it, but I would expect most rioters would be inclined to vote Reform UK. Okay, so if we look for another explanation, and this is where I would differ at least with some comrades on the left, specifically the paper of the Socialist Party in England and Wales. If you look at their paper, this is dated over a 2-week period, so they're obviously going to have a holiday. They actually headline their report, front page report of the riots and counter protests. They head it with the headline, "Jobs, Houses and Services for All." And the message is clear, that the jobs aren't good enough, they're not well paid enough, the housing is inadequate, and the services are inadequate. I agree. But the idea that this is the fundamental root cause of the riots, I think, is profoundly mistaken. The comrades, I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen a study of those that were rioting, and quite frankly, for that, we'll need to look at the court records of those that have gone up before magistrates and judges, and also those that are still in the system, who are actually going for contested court cases. So far, we've had uncontested court cases. So people have been pleading guilty in order to reduce their sentences by 50%. But I just think it's too easy, it's too pat, just to say that if the jobs were better, if the services were better, if the housing was better, people would be purring with contentment, and they wouldn't be rioting, they wouldn't be prone to racism and chauvinism. I think that's a mistake. Indeed, I would argue that capitalism and discontent go hand in hand, not only in terms of the working class, but all classes in society tend to be discontented. Why? Because capitalism has an interest in creating artificial wants. We're all meant to aspire to the lifestyle of the billionaires, of the top footballers, of the top film stars. That's the life that is for the advertising industry. That's the life to aspire to, and that includes the lower middle classes and the middle classes, and indeed the upper middle classes. So if you actually look at some, at least, of these court cases, they don't involve the long-term unemployed. A number of them involve people who you would describe as middle class. So, for example, the woman who's being blamed for saying it was a Muslim and an asylum seeker who came here on a small boat. My understanding is that she is middle class. And I have to say that in terms of the Socialist Party in England, Wales, I sort of get this sort of sneaking suspicion that their image of socialism, or their, I should put it, their expectation of socialism resembles something that owes more to the former GDR, the German Democratic Republic, than anything I would view as a socialist society. So, for example, the comrades, when they talk about housing, actually advertise, in terms of their own press, the sort of council housing that the Liverpool was responsible for, under Derek Hatton. And when I look at them, I must admit, I recoil in horror. That's not the sort of socialism I aspire to. That's not the sort of living that I would aspire to. Either way, what I wanted to add into the discussion is the counter protests, and there's no doubt that they played a big role in terms of dampening down the riots. It wasn't just police oppression. It wasn't just fast treatment through the court system. It was thousands of people coming out onto the streets, often after initial attempts of protest had been driven off the street by the rioters. And in that, I would have to say, and I don't hesitate in saying it, that from my impression, the Socialist Workers' Party and their front organisation, Stand Up to Racism, have played the leading role, not a leading role, but the leading role. And having talked about, the Socialist Party in England and Wales and their paper Spew, and talked about how they're, at least as far as I'm concerned, their vision of socialism, what they're telling people a socialist society will look like, I have to say that the pages of the Socialists make disturbing, eerie reading, because you wouldn't know anything about the Socialist Workers' Party or Stand Up to Racism if you looked at the photographs, if you looked at the reports of the riots and the counter protests in the pages of the Socialist. Indeed, they seem to have gone to quite extraordinary lengths only to feature Socialist Party placards. It's true, I can recognize right at the back, sometimes in the distance, Stand Up to Racism and SWP placards, but you have to know them already in order to know what they are. And as far as my search engine and reading the articles no mention of the SWP, no mention of stand up to racism. I think that's, as I said, quite a disturbing, how should I put it, culture that says something about the Socialist Party, at least to me. That doesn't mean I think that we should just be there to heap praise onto the SWP. I think we can still be critical of the SWP and yet recognize the leading role that the comrades have played. And of course, from their point of view, having lost the leadership of, the Stop the War Coalition because of the split with John Rees and all the rest of it, they doggedly kept on with anti-racism. And now their moment has come. And at least in terms of reading the pages of the Socialist Worker, and I have no reason to doubt it, that within the first week of the counter protests, Stand Up to Racism received £60,000 in donations. I would guess, I'm only guessing, that they would be small donations, although I could be, of course, wrong here. Anyway, on to Socialist Worker itself. They describe the rioters as a combination of fascists and racists. Okay. They also say that these riots, in terms of the deep causes, you have to seek their origins in the neoliberal turn, that's sort of late 70s, and capitalism in general. And I'm at least dubious about that. It strikes me as too much of a generalization. I actually would say myself that we need to look more to the realm of politics rather than simple economics, although I'm not excusing that quite rightly. The SWP takes to task the Labour Party and says that in this town, in this city, the mayor, Labour mayor, was urging people not to join counter-protests. The trade unions didn't play any leading role. I'm talking about the trade union officialdom. The Green Party, again, statements from here, there, and more or less everywhere where they hold any influence in terms of mayors or councillors. Don't go onto the streets, steer clear of these right-wing mobs, don't exacerbate the situation. That was basically the message that was coming. And yet, when we saw the mass protests, things radically changed. So I was looking at film, for example, of Walthamstow, and I sort of recognize it. I didn't need to be told it was Walthamstow because I've lived there and I can recognize the high street and all the rest of it, with thousands of people there, completely dwarfing any far right presence. And it was that demonstration and other such demonstrations that elicited from Sir Mark Rowley, the chief police officer of the Met, the leading police officer in Britain. He actually, as a result of that demonstration, talked about the community spirit and unity. And of course, he wasn't simply talking about those that helped, in terms of repairing walls of mosques and repairing broken windows. He was talking about demonstrations such as in Walthamstow. And therefore, at least when it comes to the SWP, talking about, that demonstration and other such demonstrations, standing in the tradition of Cable Street, 1936 in East London. Well, yeah, but, and it's a very, very big but, because in 1936, and it is worthwhile just telling the tale, what that was about, of course, was Oswald Mosley's black shirts were going to march through the Jewish parts of London's East End. And they were going to be protected by the Metropolitan Police. And it was the Communist Party and the RLP, quite rightly, as reported in Socialist Worker, that took the decision, a delayed decision, but nonetheless, it was the Communist Party, yes, including the ILP, that played the leading role in stopping the police. And they stopped the police by forming barricades. Again, it was in the face of opposition from the local Labour Party, councillors, the Board of Jewish Deputies, the Zionists. These were people telling people to steer clear, don't provoke. But it should also be added that the black shirts were a very different, how should I put it, formation than what we saw on July the 30th and for a few days on. This was no mob. The black shirts were not only dressed in black shirts, as the name implies, but they were a military type organization. They were under military discipline, and they were going to march as a military force through the East End of London. They didn't get there because I think something like 300,000 people were mobilized to stop them. And to stop them, you first of all had to stop the police. And in Cable Street, there were a number of instances where the police themselves were arrested. And certainly the police were stopped, not only by barricades, but by missiles raining in on them from tenement buildings on either side of the street. So I'm not criticizing the SWP and Stand Up to Racism for their decision not to break through police lines in order to get at small groups of fascists. I'm not going to criticize that. That's a decision you make one way or the other on the balance of forces, but it is important nonetheless to point out that those demonstrations after the call to stay away actually were praised by the establishment and the police. And you can see praise for these demonstrations, you know, in the Daily Mail, the Express, before they get back to the business in hand. And that, of course, is to demonize migrants and to demonize the very people, of course, that came out on these counter demonstrations, because what they do, at least every other week, at least when it comes to London, is attend Gaza protests, solidarity demonstrations against Israel's war on the population in Gaza. My own take would be, this is a very rough and ready, it's not scientific, on the rioters, where I would actually myself describe them as a right-wing pogromist mob, if you wanted, a Farageist, Pujardist mob. It doesn't mean that Nigel Farage gave them orders. He most certainly didn't. Nonetheless, he provided the ideological justification for these people in the same way that Enoch Powell provided justification for skinheads going packy bashing and London dockers marching through London shouting Enoch, Enoch, Enoch in 1968. And I would distinguish between them and the hardcore of right-wingers. I would call them much more likely to be fascists of one sort after August the 7th. I got no concrete evidence for that. I'm just assuming that those that went on the streets after mass protests began were more ideologically committed than those who took to the streets immediately after January the 29th. Okay, I'm now going to move on. And again, I'm going to be dealing with not just last week's news, but going back a few more days before that. And what I'm talking about is the Ukrainian offensive In the east, I'm talking about our geography in Britain and the geography as far as Kiev is concerned. So on their eastern front, and of course, what we've seen is a breakthrough by Ukrainian forces. And for the life of me, I haven't been doing masses of research, but I've been doing my damn best to find out how the hell they did it. Now, the obvious answer is obvious, and that is in terms of those manning the border, what we were talking about is FSB troops. They ain't crack. These are just border guards plus conscripts. These were people that ran. These were people that didn't put up any sort of serious resistance. And the reason, pretty obvious, I suppose, why they didn't put up any resistance is because I presume they looked at the odds and simply didn't give themselves much of a chance of staying alive. Why? Because most of Russia's army was concentrated when it came to Ukraine, not on the border of Ukraine in the north, not on the border of Ukraine in the east until you get to the Donbass. And that's where the Russian army is concentrated along with the south, the two oblasts that Russia has formally annexed. But nonetheless, I'm still somewhat mystified because I thought, have I been getting this wrong all the time? I've been going on and banging on about Russia building these defense lines, not only in terms of the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces, but all the way up the border between Ukraine and Russia, all the way along the north, and that includes Crimea, which of course was annexed in 2014. So I thought, Jesus, have I got it wrong? Was this sort of in my imagination? Did the border consist of a piece of barbed wire and a few customs posts? Well, I've sort of researched at the level of, satellite maps. And there you are. There's the Russian defense lines, not only one of them, but a whole series of defense lines. So clearly, Ukraine broke through. I never thought they could break through in the south. Last year's much vaunted spring offensive that eventually started just as summer got going, that got nowhere. Ukrainian forces were slaughtered. Their tanks were taken out, their armored cars were destroyed, even when they managed to breach Russian defenses and go over these minefields and get to the first line of trenches and take them. I've read, the description of the grunts, and that is, look, just we were pounded by masses of Russian artillery. We couldn't move at day, and obviously they eventually either died or withdrew. So I would have expected the same thing on the east. Well, clearly I was wrong. And what we have is a breakthrough movement, which is very rare, apart from the first phase of the war when Russia drove down, going towards the capital, Kyiv. That was a war of maneuver, not a war of position. Ever since then, other than Russian withdrawals to occupy defensible positions, this has been a World War I Western front sort of war until now. Now, I'm not expecting Ukrainian forces just to keep going. That would be a very foolish thing to do. They're not about to drive all the way to Moscow or anything like that. There are reports, though, of them digging in, of going, for trenches. Well, that's a sensible thing to do. How sophisticated these trenches are, whether they're supported by minefields, I don't know. There are stories, doing the rounds. I don't know what to make of them. That this is Ukraine's gamble Who knows what's going to happen in November in the United States? I can tell you that it's either going to be Harris or Trump that wins, but between them, I think it'd be very foolish to say it will be Trump now, or it'd be very foolish to say it's going to be Harris. It'll be one or the other. Either way, this seems to be Zelensky's gamble on Trump winning and therefore having some land to trade as Trump picks up the phone to Vladimir and says, how about it? So Ukraine's got some Russian land, you've got some Ukrainian land. What sort of a deal are we going to come up with? Who knows whether Vladimir and the FSB regime in Moscow would accept it, but that seems to be at least one story with some credibility. There's also the possibility that Zelensky is gambling on humiliating Putin. Here he is, the general Millissimo, the conquistador of Russian speaking territory in Ukraine. So he's saved his people from the Nazis of Ukrainian nationalism. And lo and behold, not only has he not managed to take all of the territory that Russia claims, he's actually lost Russian territory, as all the news outlets are saying. The first time Russia proper has been invaded, since the Nazis and the 1940s and all the rest of it. I don't know. I simply don't know. Either way, it clearly is a gamble. It's not impossible to imagine that as Ukrainian forces advance and dig in, that Russian forces do the classic pincer movement, cut them off, and instead of having, is it 1,000 Russian soldiers, from what I gather, young conscripts, not battle hardened veterans surrendered. Instead of that, it becomes Ukrainian forces, battle hardened, elite Ukrainian forces, mechanized units that surrender, and they're, instead of having pictures of British Challenger 2 tanks, rolling forward, it's Challenger 2 tanks with some Rusky with his two fingers claiming victory over the Ukrainian forces, and NATO supplied gear. I just simply don't know. Either way, I think there should be a lesson for those that simply look at the Ukraine war and say, well, it's obvious that Russia is going to win. It's a war of attrition. I still think it is a war of attrition. I don't think that this is going to, lead to regime change in Moscow. Don't think it's going to lead to regime change in Kiev, although it could in both cases. That would be something I wouldn't totally discount. But the idea that it was Ukrainian forces that were crumbling and Ukraine was basically, going to run out of new manpower, equipment wasn't going to come through, munitions weren't going to come through. No, the munitions were going to come through. And, from the earliest, at least I was saying that if you take Russia, Russia could have taken the capital city. Russia maybe could have even captured Zelensky. But in my opinion, at least, what we were going to have in Ukraine was some sort of prolonged guerrilla war, maybe something more. Either way, when they didn't take the capital, I thought this is a war of attrition, and everything I've seen since, and including this particular incursion into Russian territory, I still think the same thing. Nonetheless, as you would expect, if you look at a lot of Western commentary, what do we have? We have, this is the killer offensive by Ukraine. This is meant to kill off the Putin regime. We have end game for the Putin regime. We have tables are turned on Putin. But meanwhile, what is going on in the East, in spite of this, and I'm talking about the East in Donbass and the South, is still Russian advances. So yeah, this incursion has happened. It's an important development in the war, but Russian advances, inch by inch by inch, are still proceeding, and that cannot be discounted. So I think the talk of the war being in the end game much exaggerated. And of course, all of that could change depending on the results in November and who knows what. Okay, lastly, in the last phase of the political opening, I just want to touch on Biden, Gaza, and associated issues. Biden's been going on about his peace plan. We've had Blinken going from this capital to that capital. The phone lines have been buzzing. There's been negotiations, and we're told that a peace deal is near. I just don't believe it. I don't think that's serious. Hamas certainly says that, well, they're not at the negotiations. They're not participating in the negotiations. They find Israel's demands unacceptable. I just don't believe that we're on the verge of a peace deal, or for that matter, although I'm going to leave that one a little bit open-ended, some sort of ceasefire, and for reasons maybe, well, I'll explore in a little while. So what's going to happen next? Well, my understanding is that Iran has said, well, we're not going to retaliate in terms of the killing in Tehran of the Hamas leader if it jeopardizes peace negotiations. Well, peace negotiations are continuing, but I don't see them succeeding. I see them coming to an end very quickly. Then what should we expect? I don't know. I've read stories about Iran trying to do something similar, i.e. an assassination, but Mossad is in a far better position to assassinate anyone it fancies in Tehran than Iran is in a position to assassinate anybody in terms of Israel. I mean, are they going to assassinate Netanyahu? I don't think so. Are they going to assassinate some Israeli general? I don't think so. I just don't see that as a credible option. So what are they going to do? Repeat what they did last time and send off, 100, 200 drones along with ballistic missiles? If they do, maybe one or two get through, maybe one or two cause injury or death. But Israel is equipped with Patriot missiles, other anti-missile technology, certainly anti-drone technology. It's got a powerful air force that can knock Iran's drones out of the skies with relative ease. Okay, so, and then Israel promises that if Iran retaliates, it's going to retaliate. What's Hezbollah going to do? I don't know. Let off a few missiles, a few drones. To me, talk of a war, a regional war, basically assumes there's two sides ready to do the fighting. And in reality, from what I see it, there's only one side ready to do the fighting in this war, and that's Israel. Israel could say that we've been provoked to such a degree by Iranian ballistic missiles that they shoot down on their way, let alone drones, slow-moving drones, or Hezbollah rockets fired from south of Lebanon, that what we're going to do is retaliate against Iran and take out not only their missile facilities, but perhaps go for the big one, which is the nuclear facilities. I don't know. Perhaps under Trump, that might be given the green light, but I can't imagine it being given the green light, certainly under Biden at the moment. Maybe Israel is provoked to go into southern Lebanon I think that again would be a very foolish thing to do. I suspect their generals also think it would be a very foolish thing to do. But maybe the government gives the order and they go ahead. And that is a risk for Israel. You know, repeat of the last time when Hezbollah actually did defeat them in South Lebanon, and they've been preparing for round two ever since. That's, I think they withdrew, didn't they? 2006. Either way, there's only really one side in this war. You know, Iran isn't about to launch its air force against Israel. Just a joke. It's not about to launch its tanks all the way through Iraq, all the way into Jordan to get. No, it doesn't work. Okay, you know, the Houthis, you know, rocket a few more ships in the Red Sea, perhaps. But no, in terms of serious war, if we're talking about war, it's Israel that's got the capability of conducting war. The others have only got the ability to resist, and that's a different thing. Okay. Meanwhile, in Gaza, we've had the landmark, symbolic, I admit, of 40,000 deaths. And as every report says, this is a conservative estimate. Israel says that it's an exaggeration. It clearly isn't. There's going to be an awful lot of bodies buried under the rubble. How many, I don't know, but look at what the Lancet says. The last time I read the Lancet, it was talking about perhaps 140,000 dead. And I have to say myself, I've been surprised by how few deaths there have been, not from Israeli bombs and Israeli bullets, but precisely by Israel withholding food supplies, medical supplies, and the damage, the wrecking of the infrastructure in Gaza. So the lack of clean water, the possibility of a mass outbreak of diseases, which I'm sure has happened, but hasn't yet assumed proportions of where we've seen a huge upsurge in deaths. And maybe that's about to change. I don't know. I'm not in a position to judge, but we've had already reports of polio being discovered in the water in Gaza, and we've had the first confirmed case of polio in some young child. Now, there might be a few, you know, in this forum who don't know about polio. I only know roughly about it because I'm of the age of where I can distinctly remember as a young child, I suppose I must have been. I remember having a teacher who'd suffered from polio in her youth. She walked with a limp, and I think she still had a caliper on her leg. And she explained to us why, why she walked with this caliper. And I can remember pictures on television. So that must have been by the early 60s when my parents, I think, got a TV set. Young kids in iron lungs, adults in iron lungs. These are machines that keep your lungs moving. I can remember pictures of young kids, out in the sunshine. Sunshine's good for you if you've got polio. And I can vaguely remember, I'm sure, having my polio jabs. But I was very conscious of polio because, you could see evidence of it in terms of people around you, older people around me, as well as TV pictures. And, this is what happens with this terrible disease. Now, the disease itself goes way back. But my understanding as an epidemic in terms of affecting masses of people This is very much a 20th century disease. You can eliminate it if you vaccinate early enough and you vaccinate universally. You can get rid of polio, but that's not been what's been going on in Gaza. So since last year, since the October the 7th attack, my understanding is that the disruption has been sufficient that vaccination of young kids, we're talking about, babies, young children, has been disrupted or stopped. And it's precisely that age group that is particularly susceptible to polio. So adults can get it, but children are much more susceptible. And so if you take, those, I don't know, under 3 at the moment in Gaza, most of them, I would guess, haven't been vaccinated. And of course, would you go in if you're the World Health Organization and say, okay, we're going to organize a mass campaign of vaccination in the middle of Israel bombarding the place, bombing the place, issuing orders for vaccination, for evacuation from one town to the other, from one city to the other? You're not going to send your guys in to do that. If there was a ceasefire, perhaps you would go in. So maybe that will be forced upon Israel by the weight of public opinion. I don't know. Either way, the danger of a mass outbreak of polio is a real risk, and it is a terrible, terrible disease. Okay. Just in terms of the use, just thought it was worthwhile, the use of this term genocide. My own argument about Israel is that Israel is sort of pre-designed to be a genocidal regime. It's predicated on ethnic cleansing, and if ethnic cleansing doesn't work, then Israel is quite prepared to see people die either of bullets, but as is often the case in genocides, through disease, through starvation, and then people get a disease. So if it cannot manage to force people over the border into the Sinai, or push people in the West Bank over the border into Jordan, let them starve, let them die of polio or any other disease that they happen to catch. And as long as it doesn't affect Israeli settlers, let them die. That will be the agenda, not only of the right wing in Netanyahu's coalition, it will be the agenda of Likud and the whole of Zionism. Zionism is not compatible with equal rights for the Palestinian people. It's only compatible with an apartheid state, or for that matter, an ethnically cleansed, pure Jewish Israeli state. Okay, having said that, I just thought I would close by looking at the question of freedom of speech, because what we have is, in the light of the riots, but also, I would argue, in the light of the Gaza protests, and also in just the sort of response, the natural response of right-wing Labour. What we have is proposals to clamp down further on freedom of speech, i.e. Yvette Cooper fast-tracking some sort of working group that will look towards legislation and ramping up New Labour's prevent strategy. And this means referring more people basically to MI5 on the basis of racism, which we'll remember includes anti-Zionism, because that has been classified as a form of racism, i.e. anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, but also misogyny. And so the cure for violence against women and girls is to clamp down on extreme misogyny. Well, what extreme misogyny looks like, I'm unclear. I'm very wary of all such legislation. And it's interesting, just to say this, that, be careful what you vote for, be careful what you wish for. I've already referred to Cable Street, and one of the pieces of legislation that the national government passed, in light of Cable Street and the British Union of Fascists, was the Public Order Act. Who got prosecuted first under the Public Order Act? Not the black shirts. It was the Communist Party. It was the first banning went out of the London May Day. So yeah, the chances are you vote for a clampdown, or not saying vote, you welcome a clampdown on the right and their hatred of Muslims, but it's the left that gets done. It's you that gets prosecuted for being a racist because you've actually gone out onto the streets of Britain protesting against apartheid in Israel, Britain's complicity with it and all the rest of it. You get prosecuted. And if you think I'm exaggerating, forget Suella Braverman for the moment and all the rest of it. Just look at what's just happened in Germany. And I just came across this particular case. This is just after the October the 7th attack by Hamas. And it's the first sort of demonstrations that are taking place in solidarity with Palestine in Germany. And some young woman, I don't know her name, I've only got the name Ava M. My understanding is she is German. She comes from a German-Iranian communist background, and she was prosecuted and fined 600 euros for shouting out, "Palestine will be free from the river to the sea." And apparently, according to the prosecutors, this meant that she was calling for the destruction of Israel. She was saying that Israel has no right to exist. Well, here I am. I would say that Zionist Israel, given the description I've just given of it, has no right to exist. Israel, as an expansionist, apartheid state, has no right to exist. In the same way, we on the left said that apartheid South Africa has no right to exist. Now, that's not true of some in the Tory party. Some in the Tory party wanted to see the end of apartheid, but the right wing of the Tory party told us the problem is if you get rid of apartheid and you get rid of white rule in South Africa, what you're going to have is the ANC. Quite right. The problem of the ANC is that they were pro-Soviet. True. And the problem with the frontline states, if you let them go, and I'm talking about the Portuguese colonies, I'm talking about the former British colony of Rhodesia, you let them go, and what you get is these communist liberation movements, Frelimo, UNITA, ZAPU, ZANU, whatever, and then the ANC and the Communist Party. Well, yeah, that's what happened. Of course, that was in the Cold War. That's before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the right wing of the Tory party were quite clear why they supported apartheid. And what we have, of course, now is in the so-called West is a pro-Israel consensus. Okay, they excuse it on the basis of a two-state solution, but in their hearts, in their heads, they know that this is nonsense. Their advisors will tell them in no uncertain terms, no Israeli prime minister, no Israeli government is going to agree to a genuine two-state solution, a bogus two-state solution of where on the West Bank you have a whole series of reservations. Yeah, that's one thing that they slowly eat into with more and more colonial settlements. That's the reality that an Israeli government will accept, or an ethnically cleansed Gaza with the population expelled over into Egypt, that would be acceptable to an Israeli government, and an equally ethnically cleansed West Bank with the majority of its population, again, likewise expelled, but this time, of course, into Jordan. That's the reality of Israel. And so, yeah, in terms of clamping down on protests, we need to be aware that the threat doesn't just come from the right, doesn't just come, from the Suella Bravermans and the Liz Trusts. It also comes from the Yvette Coopers. It also comes from the German SDP Green government. So we need to be careful, again, what we wish for. Anyway, that's the finish. That's the conclusion. So 5